last session was the introductory session, and what I'm going to do this time is I'm going to review the tasks that you had to do for the introductory session, and try and have a bit of a discussion and a reflection on those tasks. I'm then going to cover the core topic that we have today, which is about curriculum vitae, CVs. I'm covering the sort of underlying theory. I'm also going to look at examples of how you could deliver student-centered learning when covering the topic of CVs with your students. Now, I understand your students aren't in at the minute because of COVID, so you can't do these exercises. It is possible to adapt some of these approaches, not all of them, but some of the exercises I suggest, so they can be done at a distance. So I'll mention how you might do that when we get to the exercises. I'm not sure whether you're teaching your students at distance at the minute or not. In the UK, we have been doing online teaching for a lot of 2020 and actually most of 2021 so far. So there's quite a lot of experience, shall I say, in terms of trying to do things online. So I can start to develop that aspect in future seminars if your issues continue and you're trying to start teaching online as well. So the idea of, by the end of this session, is that you will be in a position to design your own lectures. You can use as much or as little of the material that I'm presenting as you wish to. You can get your own materials, you can design your own lectures, but basically it's about delivering the underpinning knowledge to students about CV writing. It's about getting some resources together to help your students learn and to help with student-centered activity, and also to sort of help build your sort of confidence in both delivering the CV, the topic, the theory, but also CVs in terms of student-centered activities. So we will carry on and go through that over the next hour and a half. So to start with, I wanted to go through the tasks that you were asked to cover in the last module 2 weeks ago. So I have a couple of things to introduce you to, if I can find the right things on my screen here. Right. Okay. So this is the introductory seminar, the extract from the handbook that you've had now for quite a while, I think. And I just wanted to go to the end of that to go through the tasks. So these were the tasks. You had to watch a TED talk by Joe Rule, which was about a science teacher who had switched completely to student-centered learning. And he comes in with some interesting ideas and how student-centered learning can work in its entirety. We're not going that far, but you know, he's got some interesting ideas, so I hope you have a chance to watch that. It's only about 10-15 minutes long. Also to read a paper by a university in India, where they have looked at some activity-based learning, some student-centered learning, and actually asked the students what they thought of it and how it helped them. And there were some questions down there for you to reflect on in terms of those two external resources. Now, I have put a poll into Moodle. I understand that you've been introduced to Moodle, and I would try and pull my Moodle screen up if I could, but I can't at the minute. I'm not quite sure why not. But there are a series of questions in like a quiz or a poll. There's no right or wrong answers. It's about trying to gauge how you got on with the tasks. And I would normally do the quiz like we did on Zoom instantaneously during the meeting, but we don't seem to be able to, I don't seem to be able to do that on Google Meet. And I'm not sure how to get into the Moodle to make it work together concurrently. But the quizzes are on there, so, and I think I've opened them from now until Friday. So if you could try and do the quiz this week, that gives me some feedback in terms of how you found the material that we've covered so far, how you found the exercises, and that's helpful feedback for me, and hopefully it sort of gets you to sort of think about how you've progressed with the tasks from the first module. So the reflection activities about the TED talk and about the Indian paper, and then asking you to analyse something that you do already in your teaching, which is activity based, and to think about the skills that students are using while they're actually doing this activity, and then to think about a new activity that you could use in your normal teaching, in other words, around their degree subject, not around employability, and to sort of think about how you would plan that out, and how you would assess its effectiveness at the end, and then actually using that with a group. Now, I obviously appreciate this is difficult in this current time, but you might have had a chance to think about it. And then finally, it was about the role of the champion, you know, the champion in your faculty, to champion employability, to sort of bring your expertise and share your expertise with your colleagues about what you're learning about on this programme. And have you had a conversation with your manager, your faculty head about the champion role, and agreed how you're going to do it? So all of those tasks are covered in the little sort of questionnaire or poll. And I say there's no right or wrong answers. It's about just getting a feel for how you're progressing on that. I will have a go now at trying to get back to Moodle. And to just show you whereabouts those are on Moodle, but I'm not quite sure how. Right. Here we go. Here we go. So this is what it looks like on Moodle. If you go to Module 1, Introductory Tasks, this is the Introductory Tasks poll, yeah? So this is the quiz or poll, yeah? You know, asking you questions about the things that I've just spoken about that were the tasks from the introductory module. And you can get to submit your answers. I'm not sure. Yes, I put it down as anonymous, so that's okay. So your answers are anonymous, so you're not being fingered, shall we say. You're not going to have any comeback from the responses that you give. So please be as honest as possible, and then I can see, you know, what kind of response you've had from those tasks, because I want to be able to adjust this program as I go through it, so that it's the best experience for you. So that's the thing to look out for. And as I say, if you go to Moodle, as you can tell, I'm not particularly confident about it because I'm not coming out, not navigating out of it to show you. But if you go back to module CV, yeah, you'll see. And actually, this is useful because, so there's the introductory seminar. This is great. That's all been set up for me by Mr. Cand. Module CVs, yeah, you've got all the documents down there that I'm going to use today. I think you've already had the draft handbook that's already been sent around to you. But all the documents I'm going to use today are on there. And this is the introductory tasks poll I've just said. And we've got another one for the end of the seminar. So if I just click on that, I suspect as editor, yeah, as editor, it's going to take me into actually the bit that sets me up to actually do the poll. But actually Moodle is quite a useful, powerful teaching platform which has been around for lots of years, at least 20 years in my memory. So if you do end up having to teach your students at a distance, actually getting familiar with Moodle might be a useful exercise if that's what the university is using, because it does give you a very sophisticated way of sharing documents, and as I say, doing things like polls and things like that. So Right, I've now lost my Google Meet screen. Right, hooray, I'm back again. Okay, so that was a quick run through the tasks and signalling to you the poll, which is on Moodle. So if you could have a go at completing that by the end of this week, I would really appreciate it. And I can see the results, you know, sort of as you do them. So you know, they're staying there, and we can have a talk about those next time as well. So I haven't had anything down on the chat. We've got 14 people on the call, so you're all being very quiet. And of course, I can't see anybody either. So it feels a bit lonely talking into a screen, but I trust that you're there. And we will carry on, and we will go on to talk about the CV writing module 1. So I think it's quite important that students, when you're starting to develop their employability skills, understand why they're doing things, why you're teaching them about particular things. And my starting point would be actually to explain to them how to get how they go through the process of getting a job. So I've done a slide, a PowerPoint slide, which you could talk around. Sorry, turning captions, just getting used to the. So bear with me, I'll just get my PowerPoint up. Okay, so this is a PowerPoint. You could use it as a PowerPoint, or actually quite powerfully, you could draw it on the board and explain it as you go through. So steps in getting a job, and obviously this is a very sort of formal process. Not everybody goes through all of these steps, but it illustrates the general process. So the first stage is looking for a job, which is something we cover later on in the course. So looking for a job, you've got informal sources of where you might get a job from, speculative applications, your wider network of family and friends. But there's also formal sources, newspaper adverts, online adverts, job agencies. I don't know if jobs ever get sent into university and you pin them up on the departmental notice board. So there's different sources of where people would be looking for a job. But what I've also done here is I've tried to do the length of the bar to sort of just give them some kind of indication as to what happens as you go through the process of looking for a job. So you start off with maybe, in this example, 1,000 people, you know, looking for the job and sort of finding something to apply for, or to send off a speculative application. In other words, an application that's just sort of, you know, here I am, you know, you might want to employ me, when there's no actual job being advertised at the time, but you just think that you might be a good match for the company and have relevant skills to offer them. So 1,000 people sort of at that point. The next stage is the actual formal application process. And by this stage, then only maybe 1 in 10 of those people have actually applied for the job. So you get down to 100 people. And the application process typically would involve 1 or more of these 3 things. CVs, which is what we're doing today, letter application, and or an application form, which is these 2 we cover next session. So today we're concentrating on CVs because these are so important documents that people have the kind of rest of their lives and they need to continually update them. And having a good CV and knowing about how to write a good CV is a very important skill in getting a good job. And CVs are particularly important with speculative applications, where you're just applying where there is no job being advertised as such, because it's a good way of getting all the information in front of the employer in a very concise and abbreviated form, which is recognisable to the employer. So sometimes employers will ask for all of these, all three. Sometimes they'll ask for one or two of them. Typically, if you're sending a CV speculatively, you would at least send in a CV and a letter of application. So in other words, the bold statement of your background, but also saying why you should be of interest to this particular employer. So those all go into the employer, and at this point, the employer then decides who they're going to interview. And this is the shortlisting process. So maybe 100 people send in their CVs, letters of applications, and application forms. And the employer will probably not want to interview. I mean, 10 is quite a lot to interview. So 10 would be an absolute maximum to interview for one post, I would suggest. So only 1 in 10 people are going to get through to this stage. So it's quite a competitive process. And I wanted to start introducing other terminology here as well. So they shortlist. So in other words, they have all the applications in front of them. Sometimes employers do a long list first. So they might take out 30, and then from those 30, winnow them down to 10. So shortlisting and long listing, bit of terminology to sort of just be aware of. And they select the best candidates from the applications they've received, from the written applications they've received, and that process is known as sifting. So you sift to get a long list, and then sift again to get a short list, if that's how you're going to do it. They should use the criteria in the job advert up here, the job description, the person specification. So the job description, person specification, again, it's worthwhile spending a little bit of time, which I'm going to do in the next few slides, just saying what each of these are and why they're very different. Essentially, the job description is telling you what you will be doing if you get the job. So it's good for the applicant because they can see if it's the sort of job they want to do. The person specification is what the employer is looking for. So they want somebody with, for example, a degree or 5 years experience, or experience in a particular type of work, or having fulfilled a particular role. So the person specification is about who's going to do the job, who they want to do the job, the sort of person they want to do the job, and maybe some personal attributes as well. Do they need to be strong? Do they need to be willing to travel? Do they need to be empathetic or a good communicator? So maybe some sort of personal qualities as well. But the job description is actually about the doing of the job. So it's useful for the applicant to understand the job, and it's also useful in the application process. So anyway, going back to the process, we started off with 1,000, we got down to 100, we're now down to 10 people that are going to be interviewed. And next process is the job interviews, which are, most people find them quite challenging. And we will have a session, a module about preparing students for interviews. And it's important to remember that an interview, the employer, the person who's doing the interview, they should be using the criteria. So in other words, the information that's in the job description, the person specification, and the advert. So they will be using those criteria if it's a good, reputable employer. They'll use the criteria, but there will be other things as well that they're looking for at the interview. They'll want somebody who looks like they're a good match to the organisation. That they can recognise attributes in the individual that look like they're going to be valuable and useful employees. And in general, they want to have a good employee. They want somebody who turns up on time, who's diligent, who's truthful, who's honest, somebody who's a good employee, who's a credit to the organisation. And then down here, they're going to select the best person, hopefully, make them a job offer. And at that point, we've gone from 1,000 people up here down to 1 person down here. So this just helps to illustrate to students that getting a job is, it's a taxing process. It's not an easy process, and there's a lot of competition at each stage of the journey. I will carry on just because we talked about the job description, the person specification. So the next slide just tells you a little bit more about what those two terms are. So the job description should say what does the job actually do? Why does it actually exist in the company? How it fits into the organisation. So which department is it going to be in? It should also tell you, who you'd be reporting to. So if you're a salesperson, you might be reporting to the head of sales. It should also say if the post holder, when they get appointed, are they going to be managing anybody? So if you're a sales person, you might be managing a sales assistant, for example. So it should give you some kind of idea about how you fit into the organisation, both in terms of function and in terms of kind of the personnel that you'll be interacting with in the organisation. And that gives you some idea of the seniority of the role. But most importantly, a list of duties of what the person will actually be doing on a day-to-day basis. So that's a really good thing for candidates to be looking at, because they might think, well, I don't want to spend all my time, selling washing machines or whatever it is, or I don't want to spend all my time doing computer input. And if it's saying that's what you're going to be doing, then you'll know it's not the job for you. But if the list of duties seem to be quite interesting, they seem to be what the person wants, then that's a good indication it's maybe a job to apply for. So 2 things about job description: it helps the applicant to understand what the job will involve, but it also has, if employers have done it, they've actually defined the job, because there's nothing worse than being recruited into a job where the employer doesn't really know what they want you to do. So it is quite good to have a good, robust job description, because the employers have thought it through and they've said what the duties will be, what they want the person to do. So it's a good indication that the employer knows what the role involves. So a job description is all about the job. The person specification, or the role requirements, is all about the actual person to do the job. So what do you need to have as a person to do the job successfully? So typically it will ask for a particular level of qualifications, maybe level of experience, number of years experience, maybe particular skills, being a good communicator, having a lot of attention to detail, or being willing to work in varied and challenging settings, that sort of thing. So it's the qualification, skills, knowledge, skills and qualities the employer is looking for. And basically it gives an employer's ideal requirements of the applicants. And the person specification role requirements are important for the applicants, because they can have a look at that and they can say, yes, tick, I've got that, or no, I haven't got that. Or the other thing is that it enables them to identify which parts of their background to actually highlight in the application, to highlight in their CV, to highlight in the letter of application, so that they can put themselves in their best light in front of the employer. So an applicant that has tailored their letter of application, for example, or even their CV to reflect the person specification, is clearly going to stand out to the employer as being somebody who could potentially be worth shortlisting, could potentially be worth going through the sifting process. However, there's a bit of a debate about this, and we will come back to this later on in the course, but there is good evidence, at least in Europe, that men look at a job, a role, a person specification, think, oh, I can do half of that, I'll apply. I've got half of that, I'll apply. I meet 50% of the things they need. Whereas women look at it and have only got 50% to think, oh, well, I've only got 50% of that, I won't bother applying. So it does tend to be a bit of a selector. And this, basically, I suppose the sort of the message from that is you don't have to have everything they're asking for in the person specification. Obviously, you've got to try and make the most of what you've got that's relevant, but you don't have to have absolutely everything in the person specification before you apply for a job. But I guess 50% would be a good indication. If you haven't got at least 50%, then it's probably not worth applying. So I will stop sharing there and hopefully get back. Okay. And just sort of pause there if anybody wants to ask or comment anything on the process of getting a job on the flowchart. Just give you an opportunity to sort of digest that for a minute. before I go on to CVs and the theory behind CVs. So don't forget, we've got the chat if you want to, or I think you can raise your hand. Yeah, I'm not quite sure how that works, but it's definitely the chat, or you can unmute yourself and ask if you're confident enough. But don't feel you have to. So we have 15 people on the call now. Dr. Santi, if you're recording, if you're noting it.
เดี๋ยวอาจารย์ประธานมีอย่างปรึกษาคุณตื่มบ่ที่เพิ่นเล่าผ่านมานี่เนาะแลกเปลี่ยนนำเพิ่นก็ได้อาจารย์
I would like to just ask you some question regarding to your diagram of the CV, right? This one is, as you mentioned, that this one you can use as when we show to our student that what are the most important things that they're supposed to put in order to, to apply for the job, right? Okay, and then you emphasize on the job description and how you can approach, because if we want to help the student to be able to apply to the job, they're supposed to get the right information in order to attack the employer. You mean that that diagram is we can show to our student, and then we can go step by step, because in your slide presentation you just include on those, and then you got supposed to have on the tasks for each one, right?
Sure. Yeah. So I guess the slide presentation, particularly that first slide, it's really just about explaining the process in a number of different ways, really. So it's explaining the process in terms of how the numbers go down, so they can sort of see that it's quite a selection process, and for some students, they wouldn't have really thought about it like that. They'll sort of think, oh, there's a job and there's me, and they won't quite appreciate they might be competing against hundreds or thousands of other people to get that one job. So there's that aspect of it. There's the terminology, as you sort of you sort of recognize. So there's a terminology that they might come across, because they might sort of get a job description and think, oh, what's the difference between job description and person specification? So it's enabling them to sort of go into the process with a clear understanding of what some of the terminology is, and what the process is, and how the things fit together. So how a CV could be used in an application, how a letter of application fits together. And as we go through each bit in more detail, they can then sort of go back to that slide presentation and see how the different things fit together. So the CV, the letter of application, the application form gets them to a certain point, and then they have to continue down it. But yes, that's exactly right. It's kind of like it's giving them an overview of the process and some of the terminology, and how competitive it, in terms of the numbers, how competitive it is.
Can we just break down into each one, because in there we got, if we just look at it and then include several information. So especially for us, if we teach their BA program, is when I'm not sure that whether they're gonna gain more understanding on what this one. So we can break down into each one that have the student to gain more understanding in each diagram, because the diagram is include the whole things that we are going to cover in the CV. So
yeah, sure. I think it's up to you. It's up to you how you want to use it with your students, and you might want to. I mean, what you could do is you could keep going back to this. As you covered CVs with them. You could revisit this. If you've got it on a PowerPoint slide, you can just stick it up on the board and on the screen, and just say, right, we're doing CVs today, and this is where CVs fit in. If you remember this process. So I think it's up to you how you want to use it. Definitely.
Okay, thank you. I think at least the student can see that what they're supposed to include in the CV, because it's very important, because somehow they just put on the information just really some that they have, but when they have the image that which information is going to be listed in the CV is going to be easier for them to just or put on the stuff. But when writing it, it's another matter, I think. Thank you, Pam.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I think you're right. Okay. Any other questions, comments? And I will go on to CVs next.
Okay, Pam, maybe you can show about what is the weaks of CV and the strong CV. You can show them and what should be focused on that, if possible.
Yeah, that's fine. Okay, so I will. Okay, going on to CVs then. So why do we call them curriculum vitae? Because it's a bit of a mouthful. So curriculum vitae is a Latin term, which literally means the course of your life. But for some reason, it's gone into popular parlance across the world, and everybody kind of knows what a CV is. Sometimes it's referred to as a resume, particularly in the US. Often a resume will be a slightly shorter summary. So a CV might be the longer version, resume might be a shorter version. But just to give you a feel, there's not particularly kind of one thing or another, but a CV typically, particularly for your students who haven't got much experience, I don't think, I'm making a big assumption there, but they probably haven't got much experience, but they wouldn't expect to do a CV over 2 pages, 2 sides of A4, yeah, maximum, absolutely maximum. Whereas a resume might be one side, so really sort of brief overview. So the CV, the aim of the CV is to provide a potential employer with a short and easy to read summary of someone's qualifications, experience, skills, maybe a little bit about their personality. And the idea being that employers can very quickly see what a candidate has to offer. And it's very important that the CV is attractive and well presented and easy to read, because there's evidence that employers spend literally less than a minute on each CV, maybe 15, 17 seconds looking at a CV before they decide to read it properly or to just put it on the discard pile. And at this point, the chances are, or maybe the employer only has the CV. They know nothing else about the person at all, except what's on the CV. So it's really important that the CV is the most accessible document, and it's attractive, and it's not got any obvious errors in it. Otherwise, it'll go straight onto the rejection pile. So CV won't get anybody a job at all, but it might get them in front of an employer. So it might get them an interview if it's a particularly good CV and they've got a good background. But going back to those figures, out of 100 people who send in their CVs, if you're lucky, 10 of them will be interviewed. So a lot of CVs are going to get rejected. So that's kind of a bit of preamble about a CV and sort of setting the scene for a CV and how employers will view them. So if we go on to how we structure a CV, so I've got the sort of like the theory and some example CVs, which I'll go through with you, but also a student-centered activity that you might want to do about how to get to the core aspect of what a CV is. So what we'll do is we'll have a look at a couple of CVs, and then I'll come back and I'll explain how the student-centered activity might work when you're in normal teaching situations and you've got the students back in the class. And I would suggest that this is probably not an activity that's easy to do at a distance, because it does involve a sort of, a group discussion. So it's possibly not one that's worth doing if you're trying to teach at a distance. Although you could do it and you could ask students to do it on an individual basis. But anyway, CVs, right. So let me show you. One thing I just wanted to emphasize before we start looking at a couple of examples of CVs is there is not a right or a wrong way to do a CV. There are hundreds of different formats and templates to use for CVs, and it is individuals' choice as to which one they use and how they do it. So there is no rule that says your qualifications have got to be here and your experience has got to be there or whatever. There's commonality in the sense that there's the same information in the CV, but in terms of presentation and how you put it down, then that is kind of up to individual choice. So one of the first kind of things is to look at some templates of CVs so students can try those out. But one reason for that is because you're doing a CV for a particular type of occupation, probably. You know, if you want to be an academic, your CV will be of a certain type. You know, and obviously your research papers and your academic credibility and your research projects are going to be very important. If you're looking for a job in sales or in the creative industries, then your CV is like to be very different. It's like to be presented very differently as well. So your CV actually itself should kind of reflect the sort of job occupations that you're going for. So let's have a look at some examples of CVs. And again, all of these are on the Moodle thing. So, sorry, I shouldn't call it Moodle thing. They're all on Moodle. So you can have a look at them at your leisure and print them off as well. Okay, so let's just have a go at this. Okay, I'm not sure how clearly that's coming up on your screen. It's not that brilliant on my screen. I don't know if I can make it a bit bigger. Yeah. Okay, so the quality is not brilliant, but you can see, you know, they've got a photograph of them, the name, you know, their experience, their education, the projects they've done, achievements, certifications and courses and references down there, and they've done a sort of highlight block around here. So that's just one example of a CV, but it looks attractive. It's got colour in it. It's about sales. So, you know, obviously somebody's going to be looking quite approachable. It's got all the contact details in, very nicely displayed, and core skills, you know, down here in terms of the other languages that they speak, and a sort of summary of the person up there. So just one example of a CV. Another example, same sort of area of work, sales associate. Again, she looks very approachable, doesn't she? You know, contact details are here. Extra skills, language skills, and specific job-specific skills here. A personal statement up there in a couple of sentences. You know, what experiences she had, what education she had, what she worked on, what she's achieved, certifications and courses, references. So these are different ways of presenting yourself. You don't have to have your photograph on your CV, but there's a very different one. Yeah. So this is one which is a bit more kind of British, I suppose, as opposed to American in its kind of presentation. But the source of information that's on it, again, you know, up here, his name, his contact details, all his contact details very clearly laid out and very nicely spaced out as well. A personal statement should only be 2 or 3 sentences, and that's what this one is. Yeah, giving a very brief overview of the person. You know, what have they done, what have they got, what have they done, what are they looking for. You know, very, very simple personal statement there. Work history, and you'll notice they're going back in reverse chronological order. So in other words, the most recent work history is coming in first, and then his older work history down there. You know, the name of his employer, what his role was, a summary of his job and what his actual responsibilities were, and a little bit of more sort of detail in terms of the fact he was doing travelling, and he was doing travelling internationally down here. So it's very simply laid out. But one key thing is that it looks very attractive. You know, it's clearly laid out. You've got all the information, and there's a lot of information in there, but it's clearly laid out. There's quite a lot of space. It's easy. It's very accessible sort of information. And he's given you his qualification here. I don't think there's another page of this one, so he hasn't actually bothered to detail his qualifications because he's got an MEng, you know, he's got a master's in engineering, so he's concentrated on his work situation. There might be another page but it's not coming up on this particular version of it. So I've got to work out how to get back from that. Right, okay. So some examples of CVs. I want to just now stop because we've looked at a couple of CVs. We've looked about different ways of presenting them. And what I wanted to just now do was to just talk about how you might teach CVs, how you might lecture about CVs, because there's two different ways that you could do it at this point. This is the very basic, what do you put in a CV and how do you put it in? This is the very basic sort of starting point. So what you could do is you could do a presentation to your students, and you could say, right, you put down your personal detail, you know, write it on the board, get them to copy it down, dictate it to them. You could do it that way. You know, you need to put down your personal details, and all this is on the handbook. If you look on page 2 of the this chapter of the handbook, you know, you want your personal details, you want your telephone number, you want your email address, all that sort of thing. So you've got to put that in. You need to have your education in. Most CVs have their education in. So, you know, what school you went to, which university you went to, which dates you were there, what you achieved when you got there, maybe your internships that you did when you were there, maybe your projects and all that sort of thing. And you can put that in chronological order, in other words, the oldest first, or you could put it in reverse chronological order, which means the most recent first. Typically, people put it in reverse chronological order because the argument being that the stuff that you've done most recently is the most relevant to the employer. And in this sense, it's most relevant to you as well. So education, work experience. So where have you worked? What have you done? Who was your employer? What was your job title? When did you start? When did you finish? What responsibilities did you have? What achievements did you have when you were there? Interests, we haven't seen those in the CVs that we've just seen, but interests, normally you'd have a couple of sentences about your interests, because reading fiction books, or do you like rowing on the river? You know, that's two different sorts of people. You know, one indicates a bit more activity, the other one indicates a bit more reflection. Referees, typically these days you wouldn't put referees in your CV. You would say something like referees can be provided on request or something like that. Just so that your referees don't get sort of bothered by any, you know, and also you know then that the employer is relatively interested in you if they're asking for referees. So those are kind of like the core details, and you could just write those on the board and tell students that that's what you want them to put in there. And the other things that we've seen in some of those CVs that we've looked for is this is what I can do. This is my skills and my experience, and this is what I'm looking for. We saw that very well on the mechanical engineering one. And it's important that the personal statement is backed up by the information that's on the rest of the CV. So there's no point in saying, you know, I'm a fantastic team player and communicator if that's not then substantiated by evidence on the rest of the CV. You might say your skills. I mean, we saw on those marketing CVs that they particularly put down their language skills, presumably because that was potentially important in the role of sales that they were going after. One thing I have noticed from looking at some of the research that your university has done is that universities are really interested in foreign language skills in students. So English, Chinese, Vietnamese, those are all of great interest to employers. So if your students have got any competence, even if it's basic conversational English or basic conversational Chinese, it's worth them recording that on their CV. And also maybe trying to develop that a bit more while they're still at university if they can. Maybe a brief description of the sort of role that the individual is looking for. So again, on the engineering one, you know, he said, look, this is the sort of role that I'm looking for at the end of his kind of personal statement. And often if you were doing something like an academic CV, you would have, as I say, your list of publications. You might have a list of, you know, if you'd won any prizes or medals or, you know, recognition awards. That's never going to be negative to put in, as long as you're not putting in too much of those. So a CV, that's kind of like the basic information that you put in a CV. And as I say, there's plenty of CV templates to get you started on how to organise that information, but there is no right or wrong way of doing a CV. It is a matter of just making sure that the CV at the end reflects your personality and is accurate. That's important. It's got to be accurate in terms of truthful, and it's got to be accurate in terms of spelling, presentations, no typographical errors, no grammatical errors. So it's got to be truthful, and it's got to be, you know, properly presented. But there's plenty of different ways of actually presenting that information. So you could do a simple lecture and just say to students, right, this is what is in a CV. Now, another way to do it is if we go back to think about the student activity, and sort of this is all about getting the idea of CVs more embedded in students' minds. So rather than being seen as another exercise that they have to do or another, you know, task that they have to do, to sort of get them to actually you think about doing a student-centered activity. And my suggestion is that, and this illustrates some of the really general principles about student-centered activities. So the first stage is that you as the lecturer, you have to plan, you have to prepare carefully for a student-centered activity. You have to work out what you're going to be asking them to do and how they're going to do it. And that all needs thinking about beforehand. So the first point is that you need to prepare carefully for it. And in this case, you need to think about getting hold of some example CVs. Obviously, I would suggest in the Lao language, typical Lao CVs, and just get a sample of them. And they can be anonymised. The name on them doesn't matter. Personal details on them doesn't matter so much, as long as they're sort of like, you know, you can just have email and blank or telephone number and blank, just to show that that's where the information will be. So the next stage is that you organise the students or get them to organise themselves into groups of, say, 3 or 5. For some reason, odd numbers always seem to work better, although working in pairs also works. But you get them into smallish groups, and you tell them explicitly what you want them to do. So you tell them that verbally. You also write it on the board, because the first thing is that the students will all hear something different, and then they'll spend the first few minutes arguing about what they're supposed to be doing. She said this, no, she said that, you know what I mean? So if you write it on the board, they can keep referring back to what they're doing, and that helps them to keep on task, because they're in charge of themselves for this part of the class. So it helps them to keep themselves on task and to reduce any arguments about what they're supposed to be doing. So you tell them that very, very clearly, you write it on the board, and in this case, you're going to give them, let's say, 10 minutes. Maybe they have, I don't know, 4 or 5 CVs to review, and they've got to have a quick look at the CVs, and they've got to agree between the group what are the core parts, the core pieces of information that on a CV, and to make a note on how this is presented, how is this information presented. So it's really getting them to look at sample CVs and think, okay, well, this one's got education on, you know, this one's got work experience on. How is it presented? It's presented in reverse chronological order. You know, it's presented very clearly, and with the employment, they've got the information about the employer. You know, they've got the job role that they had. So it's about interrogating each of these CVs. And they won't get it all right, but that's not really that important. The important thing is they're actually looking at a range of CVs and actually analysing to see what is the core information actually on the CVs and how is it presented. So you give them a certain amount of time, and one of the things about doing student-centered learning is you've got to get the timing right. If they get too long a time, they'll just waste it and go off task. If they get too short a time, they won't do it properly. So getting the timing right, and that can change with different groups of students. So it's partly about experience, but giving them a realistic time frame where they know that they've got a deadline, so that helps them to focus on the task and to realise they've got to actually get something done by the time period. So here I'm suggesting that maybe it's 10 minutes, and that they have to feed, somebody in the group has to feed back. And if this is the first time they've done something like this, you might need to tell them that they need to nominate somebody. So they've got to spend 2 minutes having an argument about who's going to be the one that feeds back to the rest of the class. if they're more used to it, then it's no big deal. They just, you know, somebody will step up from the group, but try and make sure it's different people, different times, so everybody gets their voice heard. So they've got to make notes as a group. They've got to agree on the notes, and they've got to be ready to feed back to the rest of the class. So at the end of the 10 minutes, so the students are all working in a group, and their attention is focused on their group. It's not focused on you, so you can move around and make sure that the groups are staying on task, that if there's any issues that you can help to resolve them, but try and step back from the class so that you're not the centre of attention, which they will automatically want you to be the centre of attention because they're used to that. So, you know, they have their 10 minutes or whatever it is that they're going to do in that time, and then you reconvene the whole class. And at that point, you kind of need to signal that the attention is now back on you. It's now back at the front of the class. And you ask each group to feedback on one aspect, one element, one part of the CV that they've noted and how it's been presented. And as you're there feeding back, you're writing on the board. So it doesn't have to be in any particular order because you can organise it as you're writing it on the board. But you might ask one group and they say, oh yeah, you've got to have your qualifications in there. So you say, okay, qualifications, you write that somewhere appropriately on the board. Qualifications and what sort of information about qualifications? Well, it's the subject, it's the grades, it's the dates, yeah? So that's all down the qualifications. And you ask the next group and they say, oh, personal details. So you put personal details, maybe an appropriate place would be right at the top, you know, what's the name, what's their email address, what's their actual address, what's their telephone number, you know, personal details go up there, and so on, yeah? And so, you know, maybe out of a class of 30, you've had feedback from 6 groups, so hopefully you've got 6 different things to put on the CV, and you're writing the headings down on the board, and obviously it gets a bit more difficult for the groups that get left behind to the end, because they're sort of left with the tail end of what they have to feed back to you. But they should be able to give you something, because they should all the groups should have looked at all the structure of the CVs. They're not just looking at one part of it. So by the end of that process, you should have the template of a generic CV on the board. So in other words, you've got the headings, if you like, for a CV, so a template for the CV, which the students can copy down, and that can be their starting template. So in other words, their work has produced the template, you've just summarised what they've fed back to you. So that's kind of like a starting point of getting them to be sort of engaged with the process of understanding how a CV works. So I'm getting a bit hoarse here. I'm going to stop sharing. Right, I'm not sharing my screen, so that's okay. I'll just pause there, have a drink of water, and just give a chance for anybody who wants to ask any questions or make any comments. Don't forget the chat. Give the chat if you want to have a look.
อาจารย์ท่านใดมีหยังถามเพิ่นถามได้เด้ออาจารย์เด้อยกมือถามเลยเด้ออาจารย์มันมี raise hand
Okay, somebody's raised their hand, Santi.
Yeah, I raised my hand. So in the CV, as you show me two CV example, right? One CV have a photograph of the applicant, and one this is not. So what is the weak point and the strong point between CV with the photo of the applicant and without photo applicant?
I think it depends. It depends a bit on the type of job that you're going for, yeah, and the kind of social context of that society in which you're applying. So typically in the UK, we would not include a photograph, yeah. Those ones that had the photograph were from the US. Where I think they probably include a photograph. And I think also the other thing about including a photograph is that it was for a sales position. And if you're having to interact with members of the public and you're having to sort of, I don't know, sell kitchens or sell washing machines or, you know, sell internet products or whatever, then not so much these days, because you don't actually meet people. At least you don't here in the UK, because we don't meet anybody because we're staying inside our homes because of COVID. But in the normal situations, you know, you want somebody who's presentable. And for example, if you were going to go for apply for a job in fashion, you know, you might have your appearance matters. If you're going for a job that was to do with the visual arts, let's say, if you're going for a job as a mechanical engineer, does your appearance matter? Probably not, unless you're going to be a salesperson in mechanical engineering. So I think it's a matter of personal choice as to whether you put a photo in or not. But kind of B, the other thing is, does what you look like matter for the job? Yes or no? You know, is it going to influence whether the employer interviews you or not? And that's kind of like a judgment call. And, you know, do you want to put your photograph on or not? I don't think you have to, unless the employer's specifically asked for it. But if it's the common way of doing it in Laos that people have their photograph on for other reasons, then, you know, put your photograph on. But obviously, make sure it's a nice photograph. Make sure that you look professional in it. Does that answer your question, Dr. Santi?
Yes, yes. Okay. อาจารย์ท่านอื่นเลยอาจารย์มีอย่างแลกเปลี่ยนคุณบอาจารย์
There's quite a big debate certainly in the UK and the US. I don't know what you have in Laos, but there's quite a big debate in the UK because we have quite strong equal opportunities legislation. And so you cannot discriminate with people on the basis of their race or on the basis of their age or, you know, their sex or their sexual orientation. There's lots of protected characteristics that you can't discriminate people. So you couldn't. So there's a bit of a debate in the sense of, if you're putting your photograph on and you happen to be of a certain you know, ethnic race, are you more likely to be discriminated against because people can see you are, if you see what I mean? So without going too much into the details of that, but that's kind of, I think, one of the reasons why we have moved very strongly in the UK away from having people's photographs on there, unless it's relevant for the job, unless how you look is important for the role that you're going to be doing. So anybody else want to ask a question or raise their hand at this point?
Yeah. Professor, I have some question about for example, some students don't attend any activity in the university, but after they graduate, they want to find a job, and how would they make their CV interested to the employer? Any suggestion?
Yes, I've got a whole section of that which is coming up later in the seminar. So if you can wait for a few minutes, we'll get onto that bit.
Yes. Thank you.
It's a really good question. It's really important, especially for your students. But yeah, we'll park that and come back to it. Okay. I'm going to move on now to CV templates, unless anybody's got anything else they want to ask. Okay.
May I have one more question, please?
Sure. Yeah.
About the job for the freshie graduation, like the fresh graduate student, and when we have a look on the job description, maybe they ask for a few years or 5 years experience, and how would we suggest them to apply for the job or just step back?
Yeah, that is such a classic problem. It's a problem for all new graduates everywhere. And again, a little bit later, I'm going to talk about trying to expand what experience they have. Yeah, because I know they won't. I mean, just to give you an example, when I applied for my first job, after doing my PhD, they wanted, 1 year's teaching experience minimum, yeah. And I had never had a teaching job, but I had done a little bit of summer school work, so maybe the equivalent of 6 weeks worth of summer school teaching for the university. And I'd done a little bit of this, and I'd done a bit of volunteering work there. Do you see what I mean? I'd sort of helped out at school. So although I didn't have a year's teaching experience, I managed to make the most of what experience I did have. Yeah. So I didn't meet the essential criteria that they were actually looking for. They wanted somebody who'd had a year's teaching in a school or a university or college, and that was that. But I got the job. Yeah. I applied for it, and I made the most of what little bit I had. And that's what we're going to come on to again, is to try and make the most of what you've got. So I will come back to that point, but thank you for the question. It's very, very relevant to your students. Okay, I'm just going to try and find my templates. Okay, so there's plenty of, so moving on to CV templates. There's lots of CV templates online, so your students can have a look for the templates and choose one that suits them. But I'm just going to give you a couple of examples, and again, these are in the Moodle, so you can pull these off. So I called this one sort of the classic template. So it's just, and the template is just simply, it's like a list of headings of how you would actually structure your CV. So it's a way of kind of getting started when you've just got a blank sheet of paper, because it's always easy when you've got the headings that you want to fill in there. So this is quite a useful one. I call it the classic one because it tells you, it gives you the headings here. What's your name? What's your objective? What's your education? All that sort of thing. So it gives you the headings. But then in the text underneath, it tells you what sort of information that you want to write in that section, if you see what I mean. So very simply, put your name in big letters up here, then put your contact details there in smaller letters. What's the sort of job that you're applying for? A very brief profile. We saw that on a couple of the CVs before. The education. What do you do in writing your education? We talked about reverse chronological order. Yeah, and all the information, the degrees, titles, what you achieved. Yeah, you can. And this is actually quite a useful one for your type of students, because it says if it's the first job you're applying for after graduating, then you can also focus on the projects that you did, what you specialised in your final year, if you did anything particular in your internship. So actually you probably put your internship in the employment, but you can actually focus a bit more on your actual education. So typically the school education becomes less important as you get your higher qualifications. But you can make a bit more of your actual degree and emphasize the relevance of your degree for the sort of job that you're applying for. So I won't labor this, because you can read about it, but it does tell you, and it gives ideas to students about the sorts of things they might include in each part of the CV. So that's just one example of a CV template. And I will, if I can get back to you. Right, back to you again. So I'll share another template so you can see a different way of doing it. Okay, so this is a general template. And this has got some text in it. And it's different. The only thing that's the same really is the name at the top. The name and the contact details is at the top of the CV. And this is quite a good way of very attractively putting in your contact details, which is pretty boring. If you remember some of the earlier CVs, they had the contact details on the in a coloured sort of column on this side of the page. It's not, yeah, okay. So it's a different way of organising it because they put key skills down here, personal statement, key skills, and then the employment history. So this is somebody where their employment is more important than their education. But again, you know, what the job was that they did, PA to personnel manager, where they did it, which company and whereabouts they're located and what the dates were. But again, they presented it quite nicely, and the headings are quite nicely done as well. So it looks neat and tidy. So this will be a question of just sharing it with your students and saying, you know, look at what's written there, but put your own drafting in there, because obviously this is for somebody who's a personal assistant, a PA. It's not for somebody it's not a graduate, but it's a different way of presenting the information. This goes over to 2 pages, and she's put she or he. Is it a she or he? I made an awful assumption there. It's a she. Obviously, it could be a he. Their education has been put down further down because it's kind of less relevant for the sort of job that they're going for. So that probably doesn't make sense for your students, but it makes sense for this person because their important thing is their work experience there. But you can see it's very neatly and nicely laid out, as all the CVs are that we've looked at, and that's kind of something to aim for. But there's lots of space, it's easy to read, the use of bullet points, you know, the use of spacing, the use of different coloured and different sizes fonts without going overboard, because that's one thing we'll cover there, just sort of some tips about writing a CV as well. Hobbies and interests, we haven't particularly talked about that yet, but we will come back to talking about that. And here the references available on request. And I would suggest that that's what people do, because referees don't want to be bothered, you know, with lots and lots of contacts for employers who aren't really serious about recruiting. I mean, typically in the UK, employers will not contact the referees unless they're actually ready to make a job offer. Certainly organisations that I've worked in, I mean, references are becoming less and less important because basically people just say, yeah, they're great. You know, you don't really get much out of a reference. People with the legislative situation, people aren't particularly forthcoming in references, so they become less and less important. But if they're important in Lao, and it depends on local context, then maybe it's much more crucial to put references in the CV. So that's a different sort of CV. And we'll just show you a last one before we go on to tips about it, about writing CVs. Okay, so again, this is particularly, it says it's down for a student. So again, it tells you the sort of information that you should be putting under each heading and sort of how to organise it. And again, note the use of bullet points to make it very clear, lots of space between, make it easy to read. You notice that most of these CVs don't have an awful lot of continuous prose. So in other words, writing in sentences. You might do that in something like your personal statement, but this would only be a sentence or a couple of sentences long, not long, not lots of writing. This interestingly is put down skills and abilities as well as experience, and this is kind of getting us started on the point about your students haven't got very much experience. This person is a student and they haven't got very much experience, but what they've done is they've managed to pull out some of the things that they've done, which are not kind of formal jobs, work experience, but have actually shown that they can actually do things. They can actually got management skills. They raised a lot of money. And I would argue that this is kind of like showing more than just management. It's more about sort of, organizational skills, financial skills. You know what I mean? They could have made a bit more of this as well, but they're using the things that they've done within the university setting. Social fraternity is something that they do at American universities. I'm not quite sure what it is. I think it's where they all have, anyway, it's like a social grouping within the university. And alumni refers to the ex-students, the previous students at the university, and we'll come back to alumni because they're quite an important resource for universities. So he's worked with previous alumni groups, yeah, and obviously done quite a bit of sort of business, for want of a better word, which is all to do with helping the university. And some of the terminology there, well, a lot of the terminology is typically sort of US type terminology, but you get the general idea, and he's done a lot in terms of his work within the university and within the university setting, and he's made a lot of that. And then he's actually put down his experience. But look, his experience, what has he done? He's worked on a student newspaper, it looks like, but he's done sort of sales, and he's got an achievement there, and he's obviously sort of made an impact, and he's claiming his impact from there. And he's worked in a bar, he's worked in a pub, but he's made the most of it. He's not said, I just waited on table. He said, it was a demanding environment because it was fast paced. And, I was focused on customer experience, because, I got good guest satisfaction. So he's made the most of probably his part-time or his holiday job, yeah, and his work actually inside the university setting. And this is the sort of thing that you need to get your students to do in order to enrich their CVs. And that's the bit that we're going to be coming on to a little bit later. So that's 3 examples of different sorts of CV templates. But there will be lots of CV templates, I would suggest, online in Lao. So it's possibly a question of just finding some of those which you think are useful and encouraging your students to search for other templates as well, if you want them to do that, or just giving them a couple of templates to work to in the first instance. And don't forget, we already did a template, because if you manage to do the student activity, you have a basic student template there anyway. You have a basic template there for a CV. So they can use that, and they've generated that. So you can use that one as a starting point. I guess these ones possibly just help a little bit more in terms of kind of like how you would actually physically set it out on a page. So that is CV templates. Every time I share, I get lost again. Oh, I'm back again. Right. Okay. So that's CV templates. And they're worth having some of those, or getting your students to find some of those and to use those. I'm going to go on now to just, before I go on to sort of the enriching and making CVs more interesting, just some tips on CV writing. Now, again, there's 2 ways that you could do this. You can just look at the tips that I've written down on the handbook and add your own, and you could just tell your students them. You could just write them on the board, or lecture them, or dictate them to them, or whatever, keeping it short. Having a simple business-like font and not using different fonts. If you use the same font, you can get away with a lot in terms of bold and different sizes, different font sizes, without it looking too busy. But if you start using different fonts, it just looks awful. It just doesn't look nice at all. So keep it business-like, keep it professional, use one font, use something like, I don't know what you tend to use, but Arial or Times or something like that, which is very straightforward, not fancy. Have a logical and consistent structure, but it doesn't need to be the same structure. We looked at different CV templates. The information can be organised in different ways. Making sure it's easy to read, making sure that key points stand out. We looked at the bullet points. One key thing about CVs that employers are very picky is about any gaps. So if, for example, somebody took 5 years over their university course, and when it should have only been a 4-year course, they need to kind of cover that in the CV. Maybe they had a year out because they had family issues, or they had financial issues, or they were ill, or something like that. But generally speaking, employers tend to worry if there's a gap which isn't accounted for, if there's kind of like a year or 6 months where somebody doesn't seem to be doing anything, so it's just worth students thinking about that if there is that gap in their CV, and just being honest about it. generally speaking, honesty is absolutely essential in the CV. So you just need to be honest and to be truthful. You know, don't claim higher grades than you actually got. Don't claim that you studied subjects that you didn't, because the chances are you'll be, if you get to an interview, you'll be tested on that, and you won't be credible, because you won't be able to talk about it confidently. And it's worth thinking about tailoring your CV to the job that you're applying for, rather than just sort of sending out a blanket CV for each one. Particularly, you can do that in the personal statement. Obviously, things like your qualifications don't change, your work experience doesn't change, though you might want to pick out different parts of your work experience for different jobs. So overall, 1 to 2 pages, absolutely maximum, probably 1 page for your students. And remember that an employer will make a decision about a CV within seconds of picking it up. And I can't emphasize enough, spelling, typos, typographical errors, grammatical errors, a real no-no. It must not look messy. It must not look like it hasn't been done carefully. Those sorts of things really stand out and will lead to employers to just put it on the reject pile straight away. So, you know, those are sort of key things. Now, you can't just tell people those and write them on the board or whatever. You can just tell your students that, like I've just done. And what has it taken? 5 minutes, 10 minutes? It's quick to do. However, if you wanted to do a student-based activity which actually gets this thinking kind of a bit more into the minds of the students so that they remember it when they're actually doing the CV, then I would suggest that you think about doing a student activity, which I've described briefly there, or something similar to that. And again, it's getting the students into groups. You know, we've talked about the essential, you know, doing the preparation beforehand, telling them clearly what to do, giving them a set time to do it in. So doing all that, but giving them sample CVs, maybe you mix them up, you give them different CVs this time, and say, okay, give me your top 10 tips or your top 5 tips of what you must do when you're writing a CV, and be prepared to feed back 1 tip to the rest of the group. Yeah, so you get them to analyze the CVs, but differently this time. You know, you're sort of focusing on presentation, focusing on font and different typographical approaches and structure, length and bullet points and all that sort of thing, and get them to work those points out from looking at the CVs themselves. You call the student group back again to the front, focusing on you. You know, okay, group 1, what's your top tip for writing a CV? Oh, you need to have clear headings. Yeah, great. So you put that on the board. Group 2, what's your top tip? Oh, you need to use bullet points. Yeah, great. Put it on the board. You know, group 3, and hopefully you'll get at least some of these tips that are down here, and you might get some other ones as well, which are quite useful. So that, and again, what's happened there is that the students have actually looked at the CVs and actually thought for themselves, oh yeah, they've used bullet points. Oh yeah, they've used bold for the headings. Oh yeah, they've done, you know, a standard form of setting out their employment. Oh yeah, they've used reverse chronological order. Oh, there aren't any spelling mistakes. Oh, there aren't any grammatical errors. Or maybe some of those CVs have got those in, and they've picked those up and they've said, oh, it doesn't look very good. So that would be 2 ways of giving them tips on CV writing, because the next stage in my sort of suggested way of approaching this is that you ask students at this point to actually draft their own CVs, to actually have a go at putting their own CV together, which will probably be done as homework. In fact, I would do it as homework, and they can either do it electronically or as paper, but the requirement is that they bring a paper copy of their CV to the next class. And we'll come back to what we would do with that paper copy a bit later on. So, okay, I've got on to drafting CV. If you look at the handbook, I've put in a lecture plan about how you might develop a CV to this point. Now, sorry, I'm going on a bit, and I've just noticed what the time is, so I will skip on quite quickly. So I'm going now to talk about reviewing and enhancing CVs, which we've had questions about before, which is absolutely essential for your students, because your students will be fairly new to the whole aspect of having jobs, and so they will not be very confident about their skills and their experience and all that sort of thing. And this kind of teasing out of developing what they have got is really quite important, and it's important for your groups. So if you look at the handbook, there's an exercise there about reviewing each other's CVs. So they bring their CVs, their paper CVs, back to the next class. They can anonymise them if they want to, and they criticise each other's CVs. Basically, they look at the good points, the bad points, and out of a group of 5, what you do is you swap the CVs around between the groups, so they're not looking at their own CVs. They have to decide one person to interview for a job, you know, for a mythical job, and they have to say why they've chosen that. You know, spelling mistakes, not well presented, didn't have good qualifications, or whatever it is. So it's a way of getting students to step out of the role of being a student and an applicant to think, okay, what's it like when you get a CV in front of you and you have to assess it? So it's putting them into the perspective of the employer. And we'll do this as we go through the course, that they change perspectives so they have a different point of view. So they get to evaluate each other's CVs, and they write down the good points and the bad points on each CV. And this is why you would anonymise them if anybody's sensitive, or anonymised might be better. So it's not personal, but then you've got to work out who to give the CV back to at the end. So maybe you have to have a code, you have to have a number, so you know who it is and they don't. So anyway, so that's a way of evaluating CVs. I want to go on now to talk about developing CVs a bit more, because this is something that we'll come back to time and time again, because it's a common theme for your students. They haven't got the experience. They haven't had a chance to sort of demonstrate these skills in the real world, in real jobs, so they have to make the most of what they've got already. So the first part of developing CVs further, and this is after they've done their first draft, so get the first draft over and done with. So you've got something down on paper, which is a very basic approach, and it will be a bold statement of what they've actually got at the minute. But then the next stage is we need to look to refine that and to expand that a bit more, so that we put them in the best position for going in front of an employer. So the first stage is about developing personality in CV. And this is kind of like in the interest section. I did sort of briefly allude to it, but typically what you find in CVs is that somebody says, oh yes, I like going out with my friends, which might well be true, but it doesn't really tell the employer anything. And you've got to remember that a CV is basically your document to try and sell yourself to an employer. So without being untruthful, it's better in your interest section to actually focus on interests which might potentially have some kind of relevance for the job. So you might sort of take, for example, if you want to say, I really like going out with my friends, you might want to sort of turn that into a little bit more and say, I enjoy social activities, or I enjoy organising social activities that involve different parts of the university, or something like that. So what you're doing is you're just taking that interest and you're just developing a little bit more. And what do you enjoy doing with your friends when you're going out? Well, some people might be going out for walks, so they might be going out to enjoy nature. Some people might be going out to cafes to have cups of coffee and to chat and to have political debates. Now, all of that is telling the employer a little bit more about this person. Are they gregarious? Are they interested in nature? Do they like being outside? It's just telling them a little bit more. We don't need to overplay the interest section. At most, it needs to be, maybe 3 sentences maximum. But it's just telling them a little bit more about what the person actually is and what they do, rather than just a very, very bland statement. So, my example would be from my personal background is that, I enjoy reading fiction, but, I could expand that a little bit more to say, I enjoy reading historical classics, because I enjoy, I'm not doing this very well, but I enjoy reading historical classic books like Jane Austen, because I like the engaging with different periods in history and the sort of social environments in which people operated. So I'm not saying that very well because I've just done it off the cuff, but you could see that I could turn just I like reading into something a little bit more in depth about me personally, in terms of sort of like trying to understand how people operated in historical context, how society operated in historical context. So I'm kind of interested in that sort of thing, which tells an employer, a potential employer, that I'm a little bit more thoughtful about that sort of thing. You know, I enjoy reading, not me personally, but, you know, a student might say, I enjoy reading science fiction because it broadens my imagination. It makes me think of different worlds. It takes me to another place, you know, but whatever the interests of the students are, they need to be genuine interests, but they need to think a little bit more in depth about and to develop those to actually reveal a bit more about themselves. And just in 2 or 3 sentences, then that makes the person come alive a bit more for the employer. You know, are they, you know, does it give a clue about the fact that they're actually quite an active person, that they enjoy being outside, that they enjoy engaging in team sports, for example? You know, team sports could be quite important if you've got to be a good team player in the employment. Or do they enjoy quite reflective experiences like reading, but they think about it as well? So it's something that people don't find very easy to do. Nobody finds it very easy to do, but there is an activity there where I'm suggesting that you get students to work in pairs, probably, to develop their interest section, and then to work together to try and help their partner to develop their interest section a bit more. So they look at it individually, but they also look at it in pairs, because quite often with this kind of approach, you know, you sort of think, oh, well, I like reading, but if somebody else is there and they sort of say, okay, what do you like reading? And why do you like reading it? Just asking those questions helps you to sort of think, oh yeah, why do I read that? You know, and what do I get out of it? And what do I do with that information? You know, why do I like playing football? You know, do I like the camaraderie? Do I like the friendship? Do I actually like the training? Do you see what I mean? So you're sort of actually helping, the partner is helping the individual to kind of unpick a little bit more about why they're interested in doing that. And you wouldn't put all your interests down, you know, you might have 5, 10 interests, but maybe you focus on 2 interests that would be particularly marginally relevant or a little bit relevant to the role. So that's about interests. And moving on again fairly rapidly, I wanted to talk about harnessing wider activities in CVs, because to address this point about the fact that your students don't have experience, they don't have professional experience, they don't have employment skills they've developed through employment. However, they will have all had some sort of activity. They will have done something either within the university or beyond the university and in their home life, which they can actually help to develop. You can help them to develop it. And this is continuing the idea about developing the interests. This is about developing their kind of work, in inverted commas, experience. Even though it's not actually been paid work, it still can be used within their CV to help them to address this big gap they've got, which was they haven't got any experience. So this is another lesson. So we've done the CV, we've done CV evaluation, we've done the interests, and making the most of their wider activities. I call this enhancing their CVs. So you've got your bold statement of a CV, and then you need to actually develop it and enhance it. And this is not something you necessarily do quickly. It's something that needs sort of some careful thought about. But the sorts of things that I'm thinking about here is, have your students been on an internship? If they did, where did they do it? What did they do when they were there? What sorts of skills did they develop? What did they learn? And these are all things, I mean, they could actually put down their internship as being work experience. So that would be one slot of work experience. It might only be a month or 2 months. That doesn't matter. They've actually been in a work environment, which is good. Have they done a project at university? Again, they could turn this into an experience. Did it involve going out and talking to people? Did it involve going out and researching something? Did it involve doing research in the lab, designing their own experiments or whatever? Have they had a part-time job? You know, was it a job that they were being paid for? Did they have to do something responsible? You know, were they responsible for looking after children? Were they responsible for health and safety? Were they responsible for customer experience? We looked at that example of a CV where somebody had been a waiter in a bar, you know, and he talked about customer experience. So he'd had that focus on customers. So inevitably, your students will have done something that's not just about going to school and going to university. They might have had to work at home to help their family in some way. So they might have had responsibility for looking after a relative, maybe a younger relative, maybe an older relative. They might have had responsibility for managing parts of the house, or maybe, you know, working in the family business. But they will have done something, and quite often students just ignore this. They think, oh, it's not valuable, it's not worth, you know, they don't recognise the value of doing that sort of thing. They could have been active in something in the university, in a club or society, helping to run the club or society, helping to run an event, taking part in a competition at university, taking part in sports activities. So inevitably, your students will have done something, some things, I would hope, that they could start to develop. And we saw that CV where somebody had really turned their student experience almost into, you know, professional experience by identifying the skills that they'd gone through. And they hadn't done it perfectly, but they had made a really good effort in terms of making the most of it. Okay, so I've given you some examples down there. You know, example one of these is, you know, I worked in a coffee shop last summer. Okay, but I worked in a coffee shop which involved practicing my Chinese speaking skills because it had a lot of tourists in it. It was also, you know, a very busy environment, so I had to be very, very well organised, and maybe had responsibility for, you know, adding up and making sure that the till was accurate at the end of the day. So you had responsibility for the cash accounting. So they need to think about any little bit of actual real life experience they've had outside the classroom, and to sort of deconstruct that and to analyse it and to pick out the skills they've got for it. And they don't need to overdo it, but they just need to show that they've actually gained something from these extra activities. Right, I'm just going to try to share with you a CV where somebody's done this quite successfully, if I can find it. Okay, I think this is quite a good CV that has actually tried to do this. And this is a student who's actually just applying for a work placement, not actually for a job. But you can see he said what sort of student he is. He said, you know, given a bit about how he's progressing as a student, what he's looking for, and, you know, claiming his key skills that he's got that would make him attractive as an internship candidate. He's listed his skills down here, and he's talked about his work experience. Yeah, so again, it's another internship that he's got, but, you know, he's listed it down as if it was an employment. Yeah, and they could do it like this. They could do it as it was in the previous CV, but he's picked out what he's actually been doing: liaising with customers, dealing with legal inquiries, and also he's been doing some things in the student newspaper again. So he's been blogging. Anybody can blog. You know, he's done posts in the Student Lawyer magazine. So, and he's also made most of his work experience. You know, he's worked at a cafe. Lots of students have work in the hospitality industry. And he's talked about, you know, his responsibilities that he's got there, supervising junior members of staff, maintaining health and safety policies, which obviously, you know, relates a little bit to his legal work. And he's done health and safety audits. Well, you know, that's quite impressive stuff, really. And he works in the volunteering for a junior football squad. So all of this is an example of a CV where somebody's making the most of what little bit of experience they've actually got. And that's what your students have to do, especially at the beginning of their career. They need to think about what sorts of activities they've been involved in, which are not strictly to do with their academic work directly, but expand those to make the most of the skills that they've got and the attributes that they've had. So again, I would suggest that you do this by getting students to work in pairs and getting them to sort of maybe brainstorm to start with, where they're just kind of writing down, they're just kind of, oh, these are all the things that I've done. And then they focus down on maybe 2 or 3 of those sorts of things that they've done. And they try to develop those as being evidence of, the wider skills and interaction with other people and interaction with the world of work that they've actually done. So I hope that's useful. I realise I've gone over time rather here, and I've possibly rushed through the last bit more than I would have wanted to, because I want to spend a bit more time on it. But this is something that we'll come back to time and again. Next time we're doing letters of application, application forms. And again, this idea of maximising your previous experiences kind of outside the sort of purely academic world. We will return to that and we'll come back to it again. On the extract from the handbook, there are the activities that are listed down there, and there's a lecture plan as well. There's 2 lecture plans that takes you through like the basic CV process and then the enhanced CV process to get the students started on that. And with the enhancement, getting them started on the process is kind of literally getting them started on the process, and they need to go away and they need to think quite hard about that and to reflect on it and to develop that as they go along. And one thing I would say is that doing this process now, even if you've got kind of 2nd or 3rd year students and they've got another couple of years before they graduate, could get them started on thinking about, okay, I need to develop my skills in such and such a thing because, you know, I haven't got anything. So I need to start volunteering for a student group, or I need to start developing my Chinese language skills, conversational skills, or I need to, you know what I mean? And they can start actually beginning to think about what they could be doing now. And even if they're final year students, you know, if they haven't applied for a job yet, it's not too late for them to sort of start thinking about, oh yeah, well, if I got a vacation job in, you know, such and such a place, that might be useful. So I think it's important to kind of, the mindset is any experience could be useful in getting your first real job. And they need to sort of change their mindset from, I haven't got any experience because I haven't had a paid job, into what have I done and how can I, you know, accurately portray that on my CV to show that I have got experience of being in the world. And everybody's got experience of being in the world, and you've got to translate that so an employer understands it. So that is what I was going to cover today. The tasks for this seminar are listed at the end of your handbook chapter. And basically, it was about reviewing this information that we've covered today, reviewing the information that you've got in your handbook, reviewing the documents that are on the Moodle site, and planning your own sessions with your students to get them to draft their own first versions of a CV, to get them to understand the core building blocks of the CV, the structure, the template, the tips, you know, to produce a sort of, you know, business-like CV in the first instance, and then to do some inputs with them so that they understand the need to develop their interests and their experience sections, and also how to get started on doing that. So you've got sample lesson plans there, you've got sample activities, but the idea is that you plan your own lectures, suiting your context, choosing what approach you want to use. That's absolutely entirely up to you. get your resources together, deliver these lectures, and then think about it afterwards and ask the students what they felt about it. You know, did it work? Didn't it work? What went well? What didn't go well? Did they actually produce something that was acceptable as a CV? And by acceptable, you know, is it something that an employer would look at and say, okay, that might be worth reading? They don't need to be perfect, these CVs. It's the first time they've done them, but is it something that's acceptable? You know, what would you do differently next time? Would you give them less time? Would you give them more time? Would you do different activities? Would you just stand at the front and write on the board and get it or dictate to them? Up to you. And the point will be that next time I will be asking you to feedback on the learning points that you had from doing this CV. Now, I appreciate you haven't got the students in front of you, and you're not going to have the students in front of you for at least a week. So it might be difficult to do that, but you could at least start thinking about how you would do it when you have the opportunity. And just thinking about it, I think the CV exercise is probably best done kind of when you're in a face-to-face situation, when you have the opportunity, so that the students can work together on it to kind of work it through. There's some parts of this course which could lend itself to distance teaching and learning, but maybe CVs you could adapt these exercises, and you could get students to work in pairs on the phone or on video conferencing with each other. So you could, rather than sort of having physical groups of 5 or physical pairs in the classroom, you could get into a certain stage after input and then sort of get them working together to develop their CV. So it is possible to adapt it, but I will understand if that hasn't proved possible by the time we go to the next session. But you can start thinking about the sessions. Now, the last thing I wanted to say is that there is an evaluative questionnaire, just sort of asking you how you feel at the end of this session. Again, it's on Moodle, but I won't keep you any longer. But if you look at it on Moodle, there's the questionnaire which was reflecting on how you got on with the introductory seminar, and then there's a questionnaire. There's a few questions, 4 questions, I think. You know, how do you feel now that we've done the CV seminar and you've got the CV resources? You know, do you feel confident? Do you not feel confident? All that sort of thing. If you could have a chance to do that by the end of the week, that would be great. By the end of Friday, that would be very useful. And your results will automatically go into Moodle, and we can all see them, I think. Yes, Dr. Santi, I know we're nearly out of time. Sorry, I'm going to be quiet now. So I hope that's been useful to you, and I look forward to seeing you next time. So I will finish the session there.
Okay. So, Pam, maybe is, I don't know. Maybe let's our teacher to maybe translate the CV template in Lao language. If you share the example template to us, and then they can translate in Lao language, and they can share to students in Lao language.
Sure.
And
all the documents, Dr. Santi, are on the Moodle, so all the documents are available.
Yeah. Then all participants can translate in
yes,
Lao
language. That's fine.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, absolutely.
And share to students.
Yeah, absolutely. That's a really good idea. So all the documents are there on Moodle, so they should all be available to all the participants now. And what can I suggest, if somebody does do that translation, that they post it on the Moodle site as well, maybe via yourself, and then it's it's available for everybody to use. Yeah, that's a really good idea.
Yeah. Because I think CV, when I was student, I never learned about the CV writing during my master degree. But yeah, I think all teachers maybe can teach students, or maybe can share in the seminar. But of course, nowadays, no lecture, no seminar, or even online, because even we try to use to teach in online, but how about internet connection with the student? Also the problem, I think. So I think but teacher can share the Lao template of CV to student by WhatsApp, and then student can send back the example.
Yeah.
I think.
Yeah, that sounds good. Okay. Unless anybody's got any other comments or questions.
อาจารย์ท่านอื่นเป็นมีคำถามอันเรื่องมีอย่างแลกเปลี่ยนนำเพิ่นบ่อาจารย์สุรอาจารย์ระดมจันทร์มีหยังแลกเปลี่ยนเพิ่นบ่อาจารย์อาจารย์สัทวีเด้จากคำพันธ์มีหยังตื่นบ่อาจารย์อาจารย์นันเดช
เราว่าอยากให้แต่ละคนไปทดลองใช้หรือทดลองคำศึกษาเพราะอาจารย์คิดว่าอาจารย์จะมีเวลาหรือมีความสามารถเฮ็ดได้คนนี้โดยเฉพาะในช่วงที่เรากำหนดมันสิพอบ่คือสภาพปัจจุบันนี้เอาเฮ็ดได้บ่นี่บ่ได้เลยตามไป
Okay, should we finish then?
สวัสดีคิดว่าคือสิยากอาจารย์เพราะว่าเฮาบ่มีนักเรียนและเวลาวิชาที่เฮาสอนนั่นมันก็บ่ได้เกี่ยวพันกับการสิไปสอน CV เนาะสิสอนได้มีแต่วิธีหนึงข้าพเจ้าคิดเองเนาะคิดว่าเฮาจะโพสต์CV ถ้ามีแซมเปิลแล้วก็เฮาอาจจะเฮ็ดเป็นคำถามนักศึกษาว่าเขาคิดแนวใดแม่นหยังซี่นะเป็นไปได้บ่เนาะเฮาเฮ็ดเป็น multiple choice ลงไปให้นักเรียนหมายเอาว่าเขาคิดจังไดคิดว่า
ครับ so it depends อาจารย์รัตดมจันทร์ said that maybe it's still difficult to do the CV task for student but maybe we can show the CV template and then ask their idea about the CV writing something like that. How about their opinion about CV writing? Something like that for students.
Yeah, I understand it will be difficult at this point. I understand. Just maybe to try the preparation.
Yeah, if it is possible, probably we develop the questions related to the CV to check the student understanding.
Yeah.
So at least they can have some example or start thinking about preparing their own CV, especially the final year students.
Yeah, I think that's a good idea. And you maybe encourage them to work in pairs.
Yes.
Because if they work in pairs, you know, I have done a bit of work around, because we've been doing online teaching of students for months and months over the last year in the UK. And one complaint that comes up time and again is that students feel isolated from each other. So getting them to work in pairs, I know that you have only just started, but suggesting that maybe they work in pairs and they can work together on WhatsApp or phone or whatever, and it's reasonably easy, and then they're actually communicating with each other as well, so maybe less isolated.
Thank you, it's a good idea. Yep, we can pair them, then ask them for feedback.
Yeah, it's always better to have a different perspective.
Yeah, I think if we can have like the CV in Lao language, that would be great, because the context is very important, because I'm not sure that the translating the CV that as you post it, I'm not sure that they are relevant in our context or not.
Okay, I mean, there must be plenty of CV templates in Lao online, I would suggest.
Yes,
so
they are.
Maybe use them. Yeah.
So we'll try. Thank you.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you very much. Thank you.
ผมมีอย่างอีกที่อาจารย์ท่านบ่มีอย่างเลย
เนาะOkay, so maybe thank you very much to Pam for lecture today on the CV.
Papa.
You're welcome.
Thank you. Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Take care. See you
Bye.
next time.
Okay.
So
see
the
you.
video
Bye.
will be uploaded into Moodle, okay?
Okay.
Okay,
Yeah,
thanks.
we can see.
Okay. Bye bye then.
Okay, bye bye ทุกท่าน